Today in this episode, we ask an expert about ISO, aperture, and everything about lenses. Stay tuned. I recently got hammered with a ton of questions about ISO, aperture, speed of lenses, depth of field, things like that. I decided to ask an expert, so I'm doing a podcast with the foremost expert in lenses. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
It's amazing how complicated this is. You have ISO, you have aperture, you have the speed of the shutter, you have depth of field.
Well, I'm basically a tube with a couple of lenses inside and adjustable opening.
So, you have an adjustable hole, eh?
This is why I don't do interviews.
Sorry.
Let's start with aperture. It's defined as an opening, hole, or gap. I have an adjustable opening called aperture. It's also called f-stop.
So what's with all these F numbers?
You mean like 1.4, 2.0, and 5.8? Those are f-stops.
This seems like it would be a bit confusing to new people.
You can research all the details behind it, but to keep it simple, when you hear aperture or f-stop, you're basically saying the same thing.
So how does this f-stop thing work?
If you want to let a bunch of light into the camera, you open my aperture all the way. As you close down the opening, you limit the amount of light getting to the camera.
Well, isn't there more to it?
Let's say you focus in on something with a background. As you close the aperture, everything in the distance becomes more in focus. As you open the aperture, everything outside of what you're focused on gets blurrier. That's what's called depth of field.
Okay, so is there any rule to this?
The thing to remember is the larger f numbers mean the aperture is smaller, giving you more of the distance in front and back in focus. The smaller f numbers mean the aperture is larger, giving you more blurriness or depth of field in front and in back. It's really all about how much blurriness or depth of field you want in your shots. And remember, if you're following someone with a camera and you have a really low f-stop set, like 1.8, you'll have a hell of a time keeping them in focus.
So an aperture of 2 is way open, and an aperture of, say, 22 is way closed.
Exactly. And an aperture of 2 is lots of blur in the distance, and an aperture of 22 is almost none.
But when I close my aperture to 22 to get everything in focus, I look in the viewfinder, everything is really, really dark.
Well, because we're talking about letting more and less light into the camera.
So, an aperture is actually an a-hole?
Stop it. Okay, simply put, the ISO, f-stop, and shutter speed all control how much light comes through the lens or is processed by the camera. Basically, an ISO of 100 tells your camera to chill. You've got a crud ton of light available, like when you're outside during daylight. An ISO of 3200 tells your camera it's pretty dark and it needs to use every ray of light it can get its hands on, like at night. Just remember, the higher the ISO, the more noise ends up in the shot. Noise is that static-looking stuff you see in the background.
Okay, and shutter speed.
When you're shooting digital video, there's no shutter opening and closing while you shoot. Shutter speed in digital video refers to how long the camera samples the light that's hitting the sensor in your camera. Really, all you need to know is shutter speed controls how much motion blur is recorded in the camera.
Alright, so what does this mean in application?
If you were shooting a waterfall, you could control whether the falling water was crispy clean looking and you could see all the droplets, or smooth flowing and misty looking. It is really the creator's choice.
Okay, so how do these all fit together?
Honestly, it's really simple. F-stop, or aperture, controls depth of field. ISO controls how much light the camera is trying to process, and shutter speed controls how much motion blur is being recorded.
Okay, so I'm on a city street and I want to shoot everything in focus. So, I take my aperture, I close it all the way down to 22. Now I have a lot less light, so I up my ISO. Now there's cars moving back and forth, so I can move the shutter speed around to determine whether I want them crispy clear in the shot or if I want to see all that motion in the background.
Exactly.
And let's say I'm filming an interview on that same street and I want that cool depth of field thing. So then I would basically open my aperture a lot to get the person in focus, and then the background would be all blurry. Now since I have a crud ton of light coming in, I'm gonna have to move the ISO down until I get it looking really good.
Correct.
Okay, let's say I'm a beginner. I don't want to mess around with all this stuff. What do I do?
Set up your camera, first on a tripod, put it all on auto and autofocus on the subject, and then just practice filming lots of stuff.
Okay, I've done that. Now I want a little more control. Now what?
If you want to change the look, switch the movie control settings to manual. Now adjust your f-stop for how much depth of field you want, and adjust the ISO to compensate for how much you want the scene lit. And remember, you can always add more light to a scene and tone it down later with an editing program. In fact, many of the night scenes you see in movies were shot during the day. They were really well lit, and then all the brightness was brought down later in editing. That's a good way to capture all the detail without all the noisiness you get filming in low light.
Great. So what about shutter speed and all this?
You're shooting at 24 frames per second, set it to 48. Or the nearest number. If you're shooting at 30, set it to 60, and so on. Dude, you're in my shot.
So how do I control these types of settings on my camera?
Well, there's just too many different types of cameras to cover them all. So just Google or YouTube your particular camera for settings, or read your camera manual.
Alright, any last advice?
The thing you want to spend your time on is filming shots. Get out and practice with the camera and use a tripod. Take the same shots using different settings, and it'll soon all make sense. Then you'll be able to set up your shots quickly and get exactly what you need in any location under almost any lighting condition. And speaking of light, the technology of cameras and lenses is all based on light. Use it. If you're outside and it's dark, then use your car's headlights or your phone or some flashlights and light the scene. You'll be happy when you did when you go to edit it later. But as far as ISO, f-stop, and shutter speed, the thing you want to arrive at is conceiving first how you want the shot to look, and then being able to set up your camera quickly to get that look without having to mess around with it or think about it. That way you can spend your time coming up with and shooting your great ideas instead of falling over all the technical details. And lastly, if it looks bad through the viewfinder, it'll, well, look bad.
Thank you for your time.
I hope that clears this up a bit. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.
Hey, that's my line.
See you next time.
Stop it!
Welcome to the Basic Filmmaker.
That's it. I'm out.
So, that wasn't that hard. How much did you say I get paid for this?
Who said you're getting paid?
What? You mother piece of